The gymnasium smelled like industrial floor cleaner and broken dreams. 25 years had passed since graduation, and here I was, standing next to the punch bowl in my modest black dress, watching my former classmates parade their success like peacocks in a nature documentary. That's when I heard it, the familiar cackle that still haunted my nightmares from high school. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Oh my God, is that really Sophia Chen? The voice belonged to Madison Westbrook, the former head cheerleader whose voice could cut glass at 50 paces. She pointed a rhinestone-encrusted fingernail in my direction, her laugh echoing off the basketball hoops like a bad omen. I can't believe you actually showed up. What do you do now? Still working at that little government desk job? The crowd that had gathered around her turned to look at me with the same mixture of pity and amusement they'd worn in high school. But that memory dissolves, replaced by a much sharper one from just 3 hours later. It's the same gymnasium, but now Madison stands frozen beside the emergency exit, her face drained of all color. The thunderous roar of rotor blades overhead drowns out the music, and through the windows, we can see the military helicopter touching down on the football field, its searchlight cutting through the darkness. A young Marine in dress blues bursts through the gymnasium doors, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced precision. When his gaze finds me, he snaps to attention and speaks in a voice that carries across the stunned silence. Madam General, we have a situation developing in the South China Sea. The Secretary of Defense requests your immediate presence at the Pentagon. That single word, general, hangs in the air like a thunderclap. Madison's face doesn't just collapse, it completely disintegrates into a mask of impossible comprehension. But to understand that look on her face, you have to rewind to the moment I walked into that reunion and the cascade of humiliation that followed. You have to understand the two lives I was living and why I'd spent 25 years letting them believe I was exactly who they thought I was. The Clearwater High School class of 1999 25th reunion was being held in the same gymnasium where I'd spent 4 years trying to disappear into the bleachers. The decorating committee had done their best to transform the space with golden streamers and enlarged yearbook photos, but underneath all the glitter, it was still the same place where I'd eaten lunch alone, where I'd been picked last for every team, where I'd been voted most likely to work in a cubicle forever. I'd almost talked myself out of coming. 3 times I'd started to RSVP with regrets, but something deep inside me, perhaps a masochistic curiosity about how little people change, had pushed me to mark attending on the response card. Now, standing in the doorway in my conservative black dress and sensible flats, I was regretting that decision. The transformation in my former classmates was remarkable. Where there had once been acne and awkward haircuts, there were now successful professionals with expensive dental work and designer clothes. The popular kids had evolved into the popular adults, their confidence aged like fine wine. They moved through the crowd with the same easy grace they'd possessed at 17, their laughter just as exclusionary, their circles just as impenetrable. I made my way to the registration table where Mrs. Henderson, our former English teacher, was checking people in. Her face lit up when she saw my name tag. "Sophia, how wonderful to see you, dear. I remember you were always so smart, so studious. What are you up to these days?" Before I could answer, a perfectly manicured hand snatched my name tag from the table. Madison Westbrook, now Madison Westbrook Sterling, according to her elaborate name tag, held it up like evidence in a court case. She looked exactly as I'd expected. Blonde hair that defied both gravity and aging, a dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and that same predatory smile that had terrorized the hallways decades ago. "Sophia Chen," she announced, loudly enough for half the gymnasium to hear, "the little mouse who sat in the front row of every class." She turned to address the growing crowd around us, her voice taking on the theatrical quality of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "Do you all remember Sophia? Always raising her hand, always trying so hard to get the teachers to notice her." The circle of faces around me wore expressions ranging from mild amusement to outright cruelty. These were people I'd sat next to in chemistry class, people who'd copied my homework, people who'd forgotten my existence the moment we'd walked across that graduation stage. Now they were studying me like specimens under a microscope, evaluating how I'd aged, what I was wearing, whether I'd lived up to or fallen short of their expectations. "So, what do you do now, Sophia?" Madison continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Let me guess. Something with computers? Maybe accounting? You always were so practical." There it was, practical. In Madison's vocabulary, it was code for boring, unsuccessful, forgettable. The same label they'd stuck on me in high school, now being applied with surgical precision. I could feel the familiar heat of embarrassment creeping up my neck, the same feeling I'd experienced countless times in these very halls. "I work for the government," I said quietly, hoping to end the interrogation there. It wasn't technically a lie, but it was so far from the complete truth that it felt like deception by omission. Madison's eyes lit up with malicious delight. "Oh, government work. Oh, stable." The way she said it made stable sound like a disease. "Let me guess. Department of Motor Vehicles, Social Security Office, somewhere with lots of filing cabinets and fluorescent lights." The crowd chuckled at her wit, and I felt myself shrinking back into my 17-year-old self. The successful, confident woman I'd become in my professional life seemed to evaporate in the face of their collective judgment. It was remarkable how quickly old dynamics could reassert themselves, how 25 years of growth and achievement could be swept away by a few well-aimed words from the right person. "Actually," I began, thinking I might try to redirect the conversation, but Madison was already moving on to her next performance. "You know what I love about reunions?" she announced to the group, though her eyes remained fixed on me. "They're like time capsules. Some people change completely, reinvent themselves, become something amazing." She gestured grandly toward a group of our former classmates who were clearly part of her inner circle.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And others, well, others just become more of what they always were. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I was the other, the one who'd become more of what I'd always been. Invisible, unremarkable, destined for a life of quiet mediocrity. It was a masterful performance, really. Madison had managed to position herself as the generous hostess, welcoming everyone back, while simultaneously establishing the social hierarchy that would govern the evening. As if to prove her point, she launched into a detailed account of her own success story. Her husband, James Sterling, was a prominent real estate developer. They lived in a gated community outside the city, belonged to the country club, spent their summers in the Hamptons. Their daughter was at Harvard. Their son was pre-med at Stanford. She served on charity boards, organized fundraising galas, had been featured in the local society magazine's Women of Influence issue. The crowd hung on her every word, their faces reflecting the same admiration they'd shown her in high school. Success, it seemed, was the ultimate validation. Madison had parlayed her teenage popularity into adult achievement, and everyone wanted to bask in the glow of her accomplishments. "But enough about me," she said, with false modesty, though it was clear she could have talked about herself for hours. "I want to hear about everyone else. Sophia, you were saying something about your government job. Please tell us all about it." The spotlight was back on me, and I could feel the weight of their collective expectation. They wanted details, specifics, something they could categorize and file away in their mental database. I thought about telling them the truth, that I held one of the highest-ranking positions in the U.S. military, that I commanded respect from world leaders, that my decisions affected global security. But looking at their faces, I knew they wouldn't believe it. More importantly, I couldn't tell them without compromising operational security. "I'm in logistics," I said finally, which was true in the broadest possible sense. My role did involve coordinating complex operations across multiple theaters. It just happened that those operations involved strategic military deployment rather than office supplies. "Ha, logistics!" Madison clapped her hands together as if I'd just confirmed her deepest suspicions. "How perfectly you! I bet you're amazing at organizing filing systems and tracking inventory. Someone has to keep track of all those government forms, right? The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow. These people, lawyers, doctors, business owners, real estate agents, saw me as exactly what I'd been in high school, the smart girl who was destined for a life of quiet competence in some anonymous bureaucracy. The idea that I might have risen above that station, that I might have achieved something beyond their imagination, was literally inconceivable to them. I excused myself to get some air, stepping out onto the breezeway that connected the gymnasium to the main school building. The night was warm and humid, typical for late September in Florida. I leaned against the brick wall and tried to collect myself, to remind myself who I actually was when I wasn't trapped in this high school time warp. But even alone, I could hear Madison's voice carrying through the open doors, regaling another group with her assessment of my tragic predictability. Some people just never change, she was saying. Remember how she used to sit alone at lunch reading those military history books? I always thought she was trying too hard to be different, but I guess she really was just destined for that kind of life. Military history books. She remembered that detail after 25 years, but she had no idea what it meant. Those books hadn't been an attempt to seem different. They'd been my escape. My window into a world where intelligence and strategy mattered more than social status. They'd been my roadmap to a future I couldn't have imagined at 17. I pulled out my phone to check for messages, a habit ingrained by years of being on call for national security matters. There were 3 missed calls from my aide-de-camp and a text marked urgent. My pulse quickened as I read the preview. Situation developing in South China Sea. Your presence requested. I was about to open the full message when I heard footsteps behind me. It was Derek Voss, a quiet kid who'd been in my AP classes. Unlike the others, he'd approached me with genuine warmth earlier in the evening, and we had a brief but pleasant conversation about our shared love of books. "Taking a break from the Madison show?" he asked with a wry smile. I couldn't help but laugh. Is it that obvious? She's been holding court in there for the past hour. Some things never change. He leaned against the wall beside me. For what it's worth, I never bought into that whole popularity hierarchy thing. You were always one of the smartest people in our class. I figured you'd end up doing something important. His kindness was unexpected, and for a moment, I was tempted to tell him the truth. Derek had been different from the others, thoughtful, observant, immune to the social pressures that drove most of our classmates. But my phone buzzed again with another urgent message, and I was reminded of the world I'd left behind to attend this reunion. Thanks, Derek. That means a lot. I glanced at my phone again. The situation was clearly escalating, but I couldn't leave yet. Not like this. Not with Madison's words still echoing in my head. Not with that look of pitying condescension still fresh in my memory. We walked back into the gymnasium together, and I tried to blend into the crowd, to make myself invisible the way I did in high school. But Madison's attention seemed magnetically drawn to me, as if she sensed my discomfort and wanted to exploit it. "There she is," Madison announced as we entered. "Sophia, we were just talking about careers and life paths. Isn't it funny how you can predict where people will end up based on who they were in high school?" She'd gathered an even larger audience now, including several people who'd been kind to me earlier in the evening. They looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, but no one spoke up to deflect or defend. It was like watching a car accident, terrible but impossible to look away from. "I mean, some people are just born to be leaders," Madison continued, gesturing to herself and a few others. "Natural charisma, the ability to inspire others, to take charge in difficult situations. And others," she looked directly at me, "others are born to follow orders, to work behind the scenes, to keep the machinery running while other people make the important decisions." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were particularly creative or cutting, but because they revealed how completely Madison misunderstood the nature of leadership and power. She thought leadership was about charisma and social dominance, about being the loudest voice in the room. She had no concept of the quiet authority that came from knowledge, experience, and the trust of people who truly mattered. My phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. I glanced at it discreetly and saw a message that made my blood run cold. Chinese naval vessels moving toward Taiwan, potential escalation, need immediate strategic assessment, helicopter dispatched to your location. The reunion suddenly seemed even more surreal. Here I was, listening to Madison pontificate about leadership and success, while halfway around the world, a situation was developing that could potentially reshape the global balance of power. And they wanted my assessment, my strategic input, my leadership. I looked around the room at my former classmates, all so proud of their local achievements, their regional success stories. They had no idea that the woman they were dismissing as a pencil-pushing bureaucrat was about to be called away to help prevent a potential international crisis. "You're being awfully quiet, Sophia," Madison said, her voice cutting through my thoughts. "Don't you have anything to add to our discussion about leadership and success?" I could have ended it there. I could have made some self-deprecating comment, laughed along with their assessment of my limitations, and maintained the cover I'd worked so hard to build. But something in her tone, some particular cruelty in the way she was savoring my discomfort, triggered something deep inside me. For 25 years, I'd let them believe I was exactly who they thought I was. I'd maintained operational security, protected my identity, kept my two worlds completely separate. But standing there in that gymnasium, surrounded by people who were so certain of their own importance, I felt something shift inside me. The decision was made for me by the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance, growing steadily louder. At first, people ignored it. Military aircraft weren't uncommon in our area. But as the sound grew closer, conversation began to falter. By the time the helicopter was directly overhead, the entire room had gone silent. Through the windows, we could see the aircraft circling the school, its searchlight sweeping across the parking lot and football field. It was clearly looking for a place to land. Madison, ever the performer, seized on the distraction as another opportunity to demonstrate her social prowess. "Well, that's exciting," she announced to the room. "I wonder what's going on. Probably some kind of training exercise. James knows people in the National Guard. I could ask him to find out what this is about." But even as she spoke, her voice carried a note of uncertainty. The helicopter wasn't behaving like a training exercise. Its movements were too purposeful, too urgent. And now it was settling down on the football field, its rotors creating a windstorm that rattled the gymnasium windows. People pressed against the glass to get a better look, their reunion conversations forgotten in the face of this unexpected drama. I remained where I was, checking my phone for updates. The situation in the South China Sea was deteriorating rapidly, and they needed me back in Washington immediately. The helicopter had barely touched down before the rear cargo door opened and a figure in military dress blues stepped out. Even from a distance, I could see the purposeful stride, the bearing that marked him as career military. He was heading straight for the school building. "This is so exciting," Madison was saying, her voice pitched higher with nervous energy. "I wonder if they're looking for someone. Maybe there's been some kind of emergency and they need to evacuate someone important." She was closer to the truth than she realized, but her tone made it clear that she couldn't imagine anyone in our gymnasium being important enough to warrant this kind of attention. In her worldview, importance was measured by social status and local prominence. The idea that one of her former classmates might be significant enough to merit a military helicopter was beyond her comprehension. The gymnasium doors burst open with a bang that silenced every conversation in the room. The young Marine who entered moved with the precision of someone accustomed to high-stakes situations. His eyes swept the crowd with professional efficiency, taking in faces, assessing threats, locating his target. When his gaze found me, he snapped to attention with a precision that spoke of years of training. The sound of his heels clicking together echoed through the silent gymnasium like a gunshot. "Madam General," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison, your aide-de-camp. We have a developing situation in the South China Sea. Chinese naval forces are moving toward Taiwanese waters, and there are indications of a possible amphibious assault preparation. The Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs are convening an emergency session. Your immediate presence is required at the Pentagon." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. "Madam General." The title that had taken me 15 years of dedicated service to earn, that represented countless hours of training, strategic planning, and life or death decisions. The title that commanded the respect of world leaders and the loyalty of thousands of service members. I looked around the room at the faces of my former classmates. The transformation was immediate and total. The smug superiority, the casual dismissal, the pitying condescension, all of it evaporated in the face of this impossible reality. These people who had been so certain of my limitations, so comfortable in their assessment of my worth, were now confronted with evidence that shattered their entire understanding of who I was. Madison's face went through a series of changes that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. Confusion gave way to disbelief, disbelief to dawning comprehension, and comprehension to something approaching horror. Her mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, as if her brain couldn't process the necessary words. "There must be some mistake," she finally managed to whisper, though her voice carried no conviction. She looked from the Marine to me and back again, searching for some explanation that would make sense in her worldview. But Lieutenant Morrison's attention was focused entirely on me, waiting for my response with the respectful patience of a subordinate addressing a superior officer. The entire room was watching this interaction, trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the woman being addressed as a general by someone who was clearly the real deal. I checked my phone one more time, scanning the latest intelligence updates. The situation was indeed escalating rapidly, and my presence at the Pentagon was not just requested, but essential. Critical decisions were being made, and the Secretary of Defense wanted my strategic assessment before proceeding. "What's the current status of the 7th Fleet?" I asked Lieutenant Morrison, my voice taking on the crisp, authoritative tone I used in briefings. "Task Force 70 is maintaining position approximately 180 miles east of Taiwan, ma'am. Admiral Patterson has 3 carrier groups on standby, awaiting your strategic assessment of Chinese intentions." The conversation was happening in front of 40 people who had no security clearance and no need to know this information. But the urgency of the situation overrode normal operational security protocols. Besides, these details would be classified for only a matter of hours before becoming public knowledge anyway. I nodded, my mind already shifting into operational mode. The reunion, Madison's mockery, the painful walk down memory lane, all of it was fading into background noise as the responsibilities of my actual life reasserted themselves. "Tell Admiral Patterson to maintain current positioning but increase reconnaissance flights," I instructed. "I want real-time intelligence on Chinese fleet movements, and I want to know the moment their amphibious assault ships change course or speed. I'll be wheels up in 5 minutes." "Yes, ma'am," Lieutenant Morrison replied crisply. He turned to address the room with professional courtesy. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption of your evening. General Chen's presence is required for a matter of national security. Thank you for your understanding." General Chen, my name, my rank, spoken with the respect and deference I'd earned through decades of service. In that moment, the dichotomy between my 2 lives, the dismissed government worker and the high-ranking military officer, was laid bare for everyone to see. I looked around the room one final time, taking in the faces of people who had been so certain they knew my story, so comfortable in their assumptions about my limitations. Derek Voss gave me a small nod of respect and what might have been pride. Mrs. Henderson looked stunned but pleased, as if she'd always suspected I was destined for something significant. Others simply stared in disbelief. But it was Madison's face that I would remember most clearly. The woman who had spent the evening pontificating about leadership and success, who had dismissed me as a follower destined to work behind the scenes, now looked as if her entire worldview was crumbling around her. The social hierarchy she'd spent decades perfecting meant nothing in the face of actual authority and responsibility. I started toward the exit, but paused when I reached Madison's stunned figure. For a moment, I considered saying something, perhaps offering the same kind of condescending assessment she'd given me, or making some cutting remark about the nature of real success versus social status. But looking at her collapsed expression, I realized that anything I said would be redundant. The helicopter, the Marine, the urgent briefing, it all spoke louder than any words I could offer. Instead, I simply said, "It was good to see everyone again. Take care." And with that, I walked out of the gymnasium and toward the waiting helicopter, leaving behind not just the reunion, but the entire chapter of my life where other people's opinions had the power to define my worth. The rotors were already spinning up as Lieutenant Morrison and I approached, and I could see through the windows that my former classmates had pressed against the glass to watch my departure. As we lifted off into the night sky, I caught one last glimpse of the gymnasium, its golden streamers and enlarged yearbook photos looking small and insignificant from the air. Below us, the parking lot full of luxury cars and status symbols seemed like a child's toy collection, and I found myself wondering how I'd ever let the opinions of the people in that room carry so much weight. The helicopter banked toward the east, toward Washington and the Pentagon, toward the world where my true value was measured not in social status or material possessions, but in the weight of the decisions I made and the lives that hung in the balance of my strategic assessments. It was a world where respect was earned through competence and service, where authority came from knowledge and experience rather than popularity and charisma. As we flew through the night sky, my phone continued to buzz with updates from the South China Sea. Intelligence reports, strategic assessments, diplomatic communications, the real business of global security that required immediate attention. I reviewed the latest satellite imagery, studying the positioning of Chinese naval forces, analyzing their likely intentions and possible responses to various American diplomatic overtures. This was my actual life, my real responsibility. The reunion had been a strange interlude, a brief return to a world where I'd never quite belonged. But now I was returning to where I did belong, to the world where General Sophia Chen was not just respected but essential, where my voice carried weight in the halls of power, where my decisions could literally change the course of history. The irony wasn't lost on me that Madison had been partially right about one thing. I was indeed destined to work behind the scenes, but she had completely misunderstood what that meant. Working behind the scenes in my world didn't mean filing paperwork and following orders. It meant making the strategic decisions that shaped global events, advising world leaders, and bearing the weight of responsibilities that most people couldn't even imagine. As the lights of Washington came into view on the horizon, I put away thoughts of high school reunions and social hierarchies. Somewhere in the South China Sea, naval forces were positioning themselves for what could become a major international crisis. And in a few hours, I would be sitting in the Situation Room, briefing the Secretary of Defense and the President on the strategic options available to the United States. That was my real reunion, not with former classmates who had never understood me, but with the weight of responsibility and the privilege of service that had defined my adult life. It was a reunion with purpose, with meaning, with the kind of success that couldn't be measured in material possessions or social status, but in the knowledge that when the world faced its gravest challenges, the people in charge called on me to help find solutions. The helicopter began its descent toward the Pentagon helipad, and I could see the urgent activity below. Cars rushing through the night, lights burning in windows that should have been dark, the controlled chaos of a government responding to a potential crisis. This was where I belonged, not because of who I'd been in high school, but because of who I'd become through decades of dedicated service and hard-earned expertise. As we touched down, I realized that the reunion had served a purpose after all. It had reminded me of how far I'd traveled, not just in terms of career advancement, but in terms of finding my place in the world. Madison and the others could keep their country clubs and society pages, their local prominence and social hierarchies. I had found something infinitely more valuable. Work that mattered, respect that was earned rather than inherited, and the knowledge that when the stakes were highest, the people in charge called on me to help find solutions. The helicopter began its descent toward the Pentagon helipad, and I could see the urgent activity below. Cars rushing through the night, lights burning in windows that should have been dark, the controlled chaos of a government responding to a potential crisis. This was where I belonged, not because of who I'd been in high school, but because of who I'd become through decades of dedicated service and hard-earned expertise. As we touched down, I realized that the reunion had served a purpose after all. It had reminded me of how far I'd traveled, not just in terms of career advancement, but in terms of finding my place in the world. Madison and the others could keep their country clubs and society pages, their local prominence and social hierarchies. I had found something infinitely more valuable. Work that mattered, respect that was earned rather than inherited, and the knowledge that when the stakes were highest, the people who truly understood power and responsibility knew exactly who to call.
The helicopter doors opened and I stepped out into the night air, ready to face whatever crisis awaited in the Situation Room. Behind me, I left not just the reunion, but any lingering doubts about my own worth or place in the world. 25 years after graduation, I had finally discovered the most important lesson of all. True success isn't measured by the opinions of people who never really knew you in the first place. The Pentagon's corridors were a maze of controlled urgency at 3 in the morning. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I walked briskly toward the Situation Room, my heels clicking against polished linoleum that had seen decades of crises large and small. Lieutenant Morrison kept pace beside me, briefing me on the latest developments as we navigated past security checkpoints and through blast doors that sealed with pneumatic hisses. Chinese naval forces have increased to 47 vessels, including 3 Type 075 amphibious assault ships, he reported, his voice low and professional. Intelligence suggests they're conducting what they're calling routine exercises, but the positioning is highly unusual. Admiral Patterson believes it's a deliberate provocation designed to test our response protocols. I absorbed the information while simultaneously processing the surreal transition from high school reunion to global crisis management. 2 hours ago, I'd been standing in a gymnasium listening to Madison Westbrook lecture me about leadership. Now I was about to advise the Secretary of Defense on potentially the most significant military challenge in the Pacific since World War II. The situation was already packed when we arrived. Secretary of Defense Margaret Thornton sat at the head of the conference table, her silver hair immaculate despite the early hour. Around her, the Joint Chiefs of Staff huddled over tablets displaying real-time satellite feeds and intelligence reports. Admiral Patterson appeared via secure video link from the USS Ronald Reagan, his weathered face grim with concern. "General Chen," Secretary Thornton said as I entered, not bothering with pleasantries. "Thank God you're here. We need your assessment of Chinese intentions, and we need it now. The president is being briefed in 20 minutes, and he wants options."
I took my seat at the table, my mind already organizing the tactical and strategic considerations. This wasn't the first time I'd been called in for crisis management, but the stakes felt particularly high. China had been testing boundaries for months, probing American resolve with increasingly bold moves in the South China Sea. This appeared to be their most significant challenge yet. "What's the status of our diplomatic channels?" I asked, pulling up the latest intelligence briefings on my tablet. The satellite imagery showed Chinese vessels arranged in what appeared to be a standard naval exercise formation, but there were subtle anomalies that suggested something more deliberate. "Ambassador Liu has been unresponsive to direct communications," reported General Martinez, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. "The Chinese embassy claims this is a routine training exercise, but they've declined to provide advance notice or operational parameters as required by maritime law." I studied the formation patterns more closely, noting the positioning of support vessels and the timing of their movements. Something about the arrangement nagged at me, a pattern I'd seen before in classified intelligence reports from previous Chinese military exercises. "This isn't a training exercise," I said quietly, more to myself than to the room. "Look at the logistics ships. They're positioned for sustained operations, not short-term maneuvers. And these amphibious assault ships, they're not conducting landing rehearsals, they're positioned for actual deployment." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed my assessment. Secretary Thornton leaned forward, her eyes fixed on my face with intense concentration. "Are you saying they're preparing for an actual invasion of Taiwan?" she asked. "I'm saying they're prepared for the possibility," I replied carefully. "This formation gives them maximum flexibility. They can claim it's an exercise until the moment they decide to make it operational. It's brilliant, actually. They've positioned themselves to seize the initiative while maintaining plausible deniability." Admiral Patterson's voice crackled through the secure video connection. "General Chen, if that's accurate, what do you recommend for our positioning? My carrier groups are currently maintaining a respectful distance, but if Chinese intentions are hostile, we need to be prepared to respond." I stood and walked to the large display screen showing the tactical situation. The positions of American and Chinese naval forces were marked in different colors, creating a complex chessboard across hundreds of miles of ocean. The decision I was about to make could determine whether this crisis escalated into actual conflict or remained a tense standoff.
Move Task Force 70 to these coordinates, I said, pointing to a position that would place American forces between the Chinese fleet and Taiwan. It's close enough to demonstrate serious intent, but far enough to avoid appearing provocative. And I want continuous reconnaissance. If any of those amphibious ships change course toward Taiwanese waters, we need to know immediately. That's a bold move, General, Secretary Thornton observed. Moving that close to Chinese forces carries significant risk of miscalculation. I turned back to face the room, and in that moment, I felt the weight of command in a way I hadn't experienced since my first combat deployment. These weren't theoretical exercises or war games. Real ships, real weapons, real consequences that could reshape the global balance of power. The greater risk is allowing China to believe we lack the will to respond, I replied. They're testing us, seeing how far they can push before we push back. If we appear weak or indecisive now, we invite more aggressive actions later. Better to establish clear boundaries while we still can. General Martinez nodded slowly. I agree with General Chen's assessment. China has been incrementally increasing pressure for months. This appears to be a significant escalation, and our response needs to be proportional but firm. The discussion continued for another hour, with various scenarios and contingencies debated by the assembled leaders. But my mind kept drifting back to the reunion, to Madison's confident assertions about leadership and success. She'd been so certain that leadership was about charisma and social dominance, about being the loudest voice in the room and commanding attention through force of personality. Sitting in that conference room, surrounded by people who held the fate of nations in their hands, I realized how completely she'd misunderstood the nature of real authority. True leadership wasn't about commanding attention. It was about commanding respect through competence and wisdom. It wasn't about being the loudest voice. It was about having your quiet counsel sought when the stakes were highest. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it discreetly. It was from Derek Voss, my former classmate who'd shown me kindness at the reunion. Saw the news about Chinese naval exercises, it read. Hope everything's okay. Still can't believe you're a general. Always knew you were destined for important things. The irony struck me forcefully. While I was sitting in the Pentagon helping to prevent a potential war, my former classmates were probably still at the reunion, dissecting what had happened and trying to make sense of the evening's revelations. They were living in a world of small concerns and local dramas, while I was operating in a sphere where my decisions could affect millions of lives. Secretary Thornton's voice brought me back to the present. General Chen, the President wants to speak with you directly before making his final decision. He'll be calling in 5 minutes. I nodded, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with high-stakes communications. I'd briefed presidents before, but never on a situation with such immediate potential for escalation. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but it was a weight I'd trained my entire career to bear. The secure phone rang exactly on schedule, and Secretary Thornton gestured for me to take the call. Mr. President, I said, my voice steady and professional. I understand you'd like my assessment of the situation in the South China Sea. General Chen, came the familiar voice of the Commander-in-Chief, I've been briefed on your recommendations, and I want to hear directly from you. Are we looking at the possibility of actual military action, or is this political theater? I chose my words carefully, knowing that my response would influence decisions that could reshape international relations. Mr. President, based on the intelligence available, I believe China has positioned itself for maximum flexibility. They can claim this is an exercise until the moment they decide to make it operational. The key indicators suggest they're prepared for sustained operations, not just training maneuvers. And your recommendation for our response? Measured but firm, sir. We need to demonstrate that we take this seriously without appearing to escalate unnecessarily.
My recommendation is to position our forces where they can respond quickly if needed, while maintaining clear communication channels with Beijing. There was a pause as the president considered my words. General, I'm told you've been tracking Chinese military developments for the past 5 years. In your professional assessment, is this the beginning of something larger or an isolated provocation? I believe this is a test, sir. China is evaluating our resolve and our response capabilities. How we handle this crisis will influence their calculations for future actions. If we appear weak or indecisive, we invite more aggressive behavior. If we appear overly provocative, we risk escalating unnecessarily. Understood. Proceed with your recommendations, General, and keep me informed of any developments. The call ended, and I looked around the room at faces that reflected the gravity of the situation. In the space of one phone conversation, I'd potentially influenced the course of international relations. My words would be translated into military orders that would position thousands of service members in harm's way. Secretary Thornton stood and addressed the room. You heard the President. General Chen's recommendations are approved. Admiral Patterson, execute the positioning orders immediately. General Martinez, I want contingency plans for 3 scenarios: de-escalation, continued standoff, and active hostilities. As the meeting began to break up, Secretary Thornton approached me privately. General, that was excellent work. Your assessment was clear, balanced, and actionable. The President specifically mentioned your strategic insight in his follow-up call. I thanked her, but my mind was already moving to the next phase of the crisis. Over the next several hours, I would need to monitor Chinese responses to our positioning, coordinate with intelligence agencies for real-time updates, and prepare additional recommendations as the situation evolved. But first, I needed to check in with my operational staff and ensure that our intelligence collection was optimized for the developing situation. I made my way to the Pentagon's Intelligence Center, a secure facility several floors below ground level where analysts worked around the clock monitoring global threats. The center buzzed with quiet activity as specialists tracked Chinese fleet movements, monitored communications intercepts, and analyzed satellite imagery for signs of changing intentions. My arrival sparked increased urgency as analysts rushed to brief me on the latest developments. General, we've detected increased radio traffic between Chinese command vessels, reported Major Williams, the senior intelligence analyst on duty. It's encrypted, but the volume and frequency suggest coordination for a significant operation. I studied the communications patterns on the display screen, noting the timing and frequency of transmissions. Combined with the positioning data, it painted a picture of military forces preparing for something more substantial than routine exercises. What about logistics? I asked. Are they receiving supplies consistent with extended operations? Yes, ma'am. Supply vessels have been moving between the main fleet and Chinese naval bases at regular intervals. Based on the tonnage and frequency, we estimate they're prepared for sustained operations lasting weeks, not days. The pieces were falling into place, confirming my earlier assessment. This wasn't a simple show of force or routine training exercise. China was positioning itself for a prolonged confrontation, testing American resolve while maintaining the option to escalate or withdraw based on our response. My secure phone rang, and I saw it was Admiral Patterson calling from his flagship. General Chen, his voice was tense with urgency. We have a development. 3 Chinese submarines have been detected approaching our formation from the southeast. They're maintaining international waters, but their positioning suggests they're prepared to interfere with our movement if ordered. This was a significant escalation. Submarine positioning was always a serious matter, as underwater vessels could attack with little warning. The presence of Chinese submarines suggested they were prepared for the possibility of actual combat, not just diplomatic posturing. What's the status of our submarine assets? I asked. USS Hartford and USS Virginia are shadowing the Chinese boats at safe distances. We have positive identification and tracking, but the situation is becoming increasingly complex. I considered the implications. Each additional military asset in the area increased the risk of miscalculation or accidental engagement, but withdrawing would send the wrong signal to Beijing about American resolve. Maintain current positions but increase monitoring, I ordered. I want to know immediately if any Chinese vessel changes course or increases speed. And Admiral, make sure all our commanders understand the rules of engagement. We defend ourselves if attacked, but we don't fire unless fired upon. Understood, General. What's your assessment of Chinese intentions at this point? I looked at the tactical display, showing the positions of dozens of military vessels from both nations, all maneuvering in careful patterns designed to demonstrate strength while avoiding direct confrontation. They're escalating systematically, I replied. Each move is calculated to increase pressure while maintaining plausible deniability.
The question is whether they're building toward actual action or simply seeing how far they can push us. After ending the call with Admiral Patterson, I realized that the crisis was entering a new phase. What had begun as unusual naval exercises was now a complex military standoff involving surface ships, aircraft, and submarines from both nations. The margin for error was shrinking rapidly. I returned to the Situation Room, where Secretary Thornton and the Joint Chiefs were monitoring developments. The large display screen now showed a real-time tactical picture that looked like a three-dimensional chess game played with billion-dollar military assets. General Chen, Secretary Thornton said as I entered, we've been discussing escalation scenarios. If China decides to move against Taiwan, how quickly could they execute? I studied the positioning data, calculating distances, speeds, and timing. With their current positioning, they could begin landing operations within 12 hours of giving the order. Their amphibious assault ships are positioned optimally for rapid deployment, and our ability to respond? We could interdict their landing forces, but it would require engaging Chinese military assets directly. That's a decision for the President and Congress, not field commanders. General Martinez leaned forward. General, in your assessment, what would convince China to withdraw from this confrontation? It was the crucial question, the one that could determine whether this crisis escalate into actual warfare or resolve through diplomatic channels.
I considered the various factors that might influence Chinese decision-making: domestic political pressures, international economic consequences, military risks, and diplomatic opportunities. They need a face-saving exit, I said finally. China has invested significant resources and prestige in this confrontation. They can't simply withdraw without some kind of victory to show their domestic audience. But they also can't afford a prolonged military confrontation with the United States. What kind of victory would satisfy them? I thought about the question carefully, trying to see the situation from Beijing's perspective. A formal diplomatic negotiation that acknowledges their concerns about Taiwan, combined with some kind of agreement on future military exercises in the region. They need to appear strong domestically while avoiding the economic and military costs of actual conflict. Secretary Thornton nodded thoughtfully. That's consistent with State Department assessments. The question is whether we can offer that kind of diplomatic engagement without appearing to reward aggressive behavior. The discussion continued through the early morning hours, with various scenarios analyzed and contingency plans developed. But as dawn approached over the South China Sea, the fundamental question remained unanswered. Was China prepared to risk actual military confrontation, or was this an elaborate bluff designed to extract diplomatic concessions? My phone buzzed with another message, this one from an unexpected source. It was Madison Westbrook, and the text was brief but loaded with subtext. Saw the news about China. Hope you're safe. Never imagined you were involved in things like this. I stared at the message for a moment, struck by the contrast between my two worlds. Madison was probably sitting in her comfortable suburban home, watching cable news coverage of the crisis while sipping her morning coffee. She had no idea I was sitting in the Pentagon helping to manage the situation she was watching unfold on television. The irony was almost overwhelming. The woman who had spent an entire evening lecturing me about leadership and success had no concept of the actual weight of responsibility I carried. While she was managing charity galas and country club politics, I was helping to prevent potential wars and advise world leaders on matters of global significance. But more than irony, I felt a sense of clarity about my own path and purpose. The reunion had forced me to confront the gap between how others perceived me and who I actually was. In doing so, it had reinforced my understanding of where I truly belonged and what really mattered. A new message appeared on the tactical display. Chinese fleet movements had slowed, and several vessels appeared to be changing course slightly. It wasn't a withdrawal, but it suggested that Beijing might be reconsidering their aggressive posture. General Major Williams called from his position at the intelligence station, "We're detecting changes in Chinese communication patterns. The frequency of encrypted transmissions has decreased significantly in the past hour." I walked over to examine the communication analysis. Reduced radio traffic could indicate several things: a pause in operations while commanders received new orders, a shift from active maneuvering to defensive positioning, or preparation for withdrawal.
What about logistics vessels? I asked. Are they still moving supplies to the main fleet? No, ma'am. Supply runs have ceased for the past 2 hours. The logistics ships are maintaining position but no longer approaching combat vessels. This was potentially significant. Military forces preparing for extended operations required continuous resupply. A halt in logistics support could indicate that China was reconsidering the duration or intensity of their confrontation. I returned to the main conference table and shared my analysis with Secretary Thornton and the Joint Chiefs. The pattern suggests China may be reassessing their position, I reported. Reduced communications and halted logistics support could indicate they're looking for an exit strategy. Or they could be consolidating for a more focused action, General Martinez observed cautiously. We shouldn't assume reduced activity means reduced threat. He was right, of course. In military analysis, apparent de-escalation could be deceptive, designed to lower enemy vigilance before launching a surprise attack. But combined with other indicators, the pattern suggested that China's initial aggressive posture was softening. Secretary Thornton's secure phone rang, and she answered immediately. After a brief conversation, she hung up and addressed the room. That was the State Department. Chinese Ambassador Liu has requested an emergency meeting with the Secretary of State. They're calling it urgent diplomatic consultations regarding regional stability. This was the first sign that China was actively seeking a diplomatic resolution. Requesting formal consultations was a significant step that suggested Beijing was looking for a way to resolve the confrontation without further escalation. General Chen, Secretary Thornton said, I want your assessment of whether we should adjust our military positioning in response to this diplomatic overture. I considered the question carefully, weighing the risks of appearing either weak or overly aggressive. I recommend maintaining current positions while the diplomatic discussions proceed, I said. We need to demonstrate that diplomatic engagement doesn't mean military weakness. Any reduction in our presence should come only after concrete Chinese actions, not just diplomatic words. The next several hours were a delicate balance of military positioning and diplomatic signaling. Chinese naval forces began gradually spreading out from their concentrated formation, still maintaining their presence but reducing the appearance of immediate threat. American forces matched these movements, maintaining defensive positioning while avoiding actions that could be interpreted as provocative. By noon, the crisis had evolved into a complex diplomatic negotiation conducted through careful military movements and formal diplomatic channels. Both sides were looking for ways to claim victory while avoiding the catastrophic consequences of actual military confrontation. I found myself thinking again about the reunion and Madison's confident assertions about leadership. Real leadership, I had learned through experiences like this, wasn't about commanding attention or dominating conversations. It was about making sound decisions under extreme pressure, about considering multiple perspectives and long-term consequences, about bearing responsibility for outcomes that affected thousands or millions of lives. The phone call from the president had lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes could influence the course of history. The recommendations I made were based on years of training, study, and experience, but they still required courage to advocate for difficult decisions when the stakes were impossibly high. As the day progressed, diplomatic channels began producing results. China agreed to reduce their naval exercise to a smaller scale and shorter duration, while the United States agreed to participate in future discussions about maritime security in the region. Both sides could claim some measure of success while stepping back from the brink of potential military conflict. By evening, the immediate crisis had passed, though tensions remained high and monitoring would continue for weeks. I finally had a moment to step away from the Situation Room and process what had transpired over the past 18 hours. Walking through the Pentagon's quiet corridors, I reflected on the strange journey from high school reunion to international crisis management. The contrast was almost surreal, from Madison's petty social hierarchies to decisions that could affect global stability. From being dismissed as a boring bureaucrat to advising the President of the United States on matters of war and peace. The experience had crystallized something important about the nature of respect and recognition. Madison and my former classmates valued the kind of success that was visible and socially validated: expensive cars, prestigious addresses, membership in exclusive clubs. But the most important work often happened in windowless rooms, in classified briefings, in conversations that would never be reported in society magazines. My phone buzzed with one final message of the day, this one from Derek Voss. "Whatever you did today, thank you for your service. Proud to have known you in high school, even prouder to know you now."
It was a simple message, but it carried more weight than all of Madison's social validation combined. Derek understood something that many people never grasped, that true success wasn't measured in material possessions or social status, but in the positive impact you had on the world around you. As I prepared to leave the Pentagon and return to my quiet home, I realized that the reunion had served an unexpected purpose. It had reminded me of how far I'd traveled, not just professionally, but personally. I was no longer the insecure teenager seeking approval from people who would never truly understand my worth. I had found my place in a world where merit mattered more than popularity, where competence trumped charisma, where quiet service carried more weight than loud self-promotion. The crisis in the South China Sea was over, at least for now. But the larger questions about America's role in the world, about the balance between strength and diplomacy, about the responsibilities of leadership in a complex global environment, those questions would continue to challenge and define my career. Walking out into the cool evening air, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, not because I had been recognized or validated by my former classmates, but because I had contributed to preventing a potential war, had helped guide my country through a dangerous moment, had earned the trust of leaders who turned to me when the stakes were highest. That was a kind of success that Madison Westbrook and her social circle would never understand, but it was also the kind of success that truly mattered. It was the success of service, of sacrifice, of bearing responsibility not for personal glory, but for the greater good. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, I could rest in the knowledge that when my country needed me most, I had been ready to answer the call. 3 months had passed since the South China Sea crisis, and life had settled into a new rhythm of increased responsibility and global recognition. The successful de-escalation had not gone unnoticed in Washington or international circles. My strategic recommendations had been credited with preventing what could have become a devastating military confrontation, and the president had publicly acknowledged the Pentagon's role in the diplomatic resolution. But success at that level came with its own complexities. I found myself fielding requests for congressional testimony, international security conferences, and high-level briefings with allied nations. The quiet anonymity that had once defined my professional life was gradually being replaced by a different kind of visibility, one measured in security clearances and diplomatic protocols rather than social media followers. It was during one of these increasingly frequent international engagements that I received an unexpected call that would bring my two worlds colliding together once again. I was in my Pentagon office reviewing intelligence assessments for an upcoming NATO meeting when my aide knocked and entered with an unusually puzzled expression. "General, I have Secretary of State Harrison on line 2, she said. "She mentioned something about a humanitarian crisis and asked specifically for you." I picked up the secure line, wondering what international situation might require military input to the State Department's humanitarian efforts. "Madam Secretary, General Chen here. How can I assist you?" "General, we have an unusual situation developing in Southeast Asia," came the familiar voice of Secretary Harrison. "There's been a massive earthquake in the Philippines, magnitude 8.2, and the devastation is extensive. The Philippine government has requested international assistance, and the president wants to coordinate a comprehensive relief operation." I pulled up the preliminary reports on my computer, scanning the initial damage assessments and casualty estimates. The earthquake had struck during peak morning hours, collapsing buildings and infrastructure across several major population centers. Early estimates suggested thousands of casualties and hundreds of thousands displaced. "What kind of military assets are you considering for the relief operation?" I asked, already mentally cataloging the resources that would be needed for a humanitarian mission of this scale. "That's why I'm calling you directly, General. The president wants you to lead the entire operation. Military logistics, international coordination, interagency cooperation, everything. He was very specific that he wants the person who handled the China situation to manage this crisis as well."
I felt the familiar surge of responsibility that came with major assignments, but this was different from military crisis management. Humanitarian relief operations required different skills, different sensitivities, different measures of success. Instead of preventing conflict, the goal was saving lives and rebuilding communities. I'll need to coordinate with U.S. Aid, the Red Cross, and multiple international partners, I said, already beginning to organize the complex web of agencies and organizations that would be involved. When does the president want the operation to begin? Your wheel's up in 6 hours, General. We're establishing a forward command center in Manila, and you'll have authority to coordinate all American relief efforts. This is a big one, Sophia. The international community is watching how we respond. After ending the call, I spent the next several hours in intensive preparation. Maps of the affected regions, personnel files for the officers who would serve under my command, logistics assessments for moving massive quantities of relief supplies across the Pacific. It was a different kind of strategic planning, but it drew on the same analytical skills and organizational abilities that had served me throughout my career. The flight to Manila gave me time to study the detailed damage reports and coordinate with various agency heads who would be part of the relief operation. By the time we landed, I had established communication protocols with Philippine military officials, Red Cross administrators, and UN humanitarian coordinators. The devastation was worse than the initial reports had suggested. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, hospitals and schools destroyed, transportation infrastructure severely damaged. The scale of human suffering was overwhelming, but it was also the kind of challenge that brought out the best in military logistics and organizational capability. I established the Forward Command Center in a reinforced building that had survived the earthquake relatively intact, and within hours, we had coordination protocols in place with all major relief organizations. American military transport aircraft began arriving with medical supplies, water purification equipment, and temporary shelters. The Navy hospital ships were repositioned to provide emergency medical care for the most severely injured. The operation required the same kind of strategic thinking I'd applied to military crises, but with humanitarian rather than tactical objectives. Instead of positioning forces to deter enemy action, I was positioning resources to save lives and restore basic services. Instead of intelligence assessments of hostile intentions, I was analyzing logistical challenges and population displacement patterns. Working 18-hour days in the sweltering heat of the disaster zone, I found a different kind of satisfaction than I'd experienced in traditional military operations. Each decision had immediate, visible impact on human lives. When we established a field hospital, injured people received treatment. When we restored water purification systems, families had access to clean drinking water. When we cleared debris from roads, emergency vehicles could reach isolated communities. 2 weeks into the operation, we had established a functioning relief infrastructure that was providing assistance to over 300,000 displaced people. International media coverage had been extensive, with particular focus on American leadership in coordinating the multinational response. My name and image had appeared in newspapers and television reports around the world, always in the context of humanitarian leadership rather than military strategy. It was during this period of intense international attention that I received a call that transported me instantly back to the world I'd left behind in Florida. My aide handed me a satellite phone with a bemused expression. "General, there's someone on the line who claims to be from your high school. She says it's urgent and relates to your humanitarian work in the Philippines." Puzzled, I took the phone, wondering what possible connection my high school could have to disaster relief operations. "This is General Chen." "Sophia, oh my God, I can't believe I'm actually talking to you." The voice was unmistakably Madison Westbrook, though it carried a breathless quality I'd never heard before. "I've been seeing you on the news constantly and I just had to call. This is so incredible." I walked to a quieter corner of the command center, trying to process this unexpected intrusion of my past into my present crisis management. "Madison, how did you get this number?"
This is a military operation line. "Oh, I have connections," she said with a hint of her old self-importance, though it sounded forced and uncertain. "My husband knows someone who knows someone at the State Department." "Sophia, I had no idea. I mean, none of us had any idea how important you really are. You're on CNN every night. Anderson Cooper mentioned you specifically." I could hear the mixture of awe, confusion, and something approaching desperation in her voice. The same woman who had dismissed me as a boring government bureaucrat was now calling me in the middle of an international humanitarian crisis to express her amazement at my prominence. Madison, I'm in the middle of coordinating relief operations for earthquake victims, I said gently but firmly. Unless this is related to humanitarian assistance, I need to keep this line clear for emergency communications. No, I understand. It's just, Sophia, everyone from the reunion has been talking about you constantly since that night. The helicopter, the general thing, and now this disaster relief stuff. You're like famous, and we all feel so stupid for not knowing who you really were. There it was. The real reason for her call wasn't congratulations or concern for earthquake victims. It was the social discomfort of having misjudged someone who had turned out to be genuinely important in ways that even her status-obsessed worldview could understand. Madison, I need to go, I said. We're coordinating medical evacuations for critical patients. Wait, Sophia, there's something else. The reason I really called. Her voice took on a different tone, more calculated. I'm on the board of the Children's Foundation, and we're planning a major fundraising gala for disaster relief. I was wondering if you might consider being our keynote speaker when you return. Think of the publicity. I mean, the awareness we could raise for the cause. And there it was. Madison hadn't called out of genuine recognition of my service or concern for earthquake victims. She'd called because my newfound public prominence could benefit her social standing and charitable organization. The woman who had spent an evening mocking my boring government job was now trying to leverage my visibility for her own purposes. I'll have my staff review any formal requests, I said diplomatically. Right now, I need to focus on the immediate crisis. Of course. I just think it would be amazing to have you speak. Everyone would be so impressed. I mean, so inspired by your service. I ended the call and stood for a moment in the organized chaos of the command center, struck once again by the contrast between the worlds I inhabited. Outside, Marine helicopter crews were loading injured civilians for medical evacuation. Aid workers were distributing food and water to families who had lost everything. Military engineers were working around the clock to restore basic infrastructure. And Madison was thinking about how my presence at her charity gala might impress her social circle. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so perfectly illustrative of the fundamental difference in our priorities and worldviews. Madison measured success in terms of social validation and public recognition, while I measured it in lives saved and communities rebuilt. Over the following days, my staff began reporting an unusual number of contact attempts from various people claiming connections to my past. Former classmates, distant relatives, even people who claimed to remember me from elementary school were somehow tracking down official channels to request meetings, interviews, or assistance with their own projects and organizations. My aide, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, handled these requests with military efficiency and diplomatic tact. General, you've received 14 interview requests from Florida media outlets, 6 speaking engagement offers, and something called a High School Hall of Fame nomination, she reported during one of our daily briefings. File them all for review after we complete the current operation, I instructed. Right now, our focus needs to remain on humanitarian assistance. But the intrusions continued. Social media posts began appearing with my high school yearbook photos alongside recent news images from the Philippines. Classmates I hadn't spoken to in decades were posting about their memories of knowing me, claiming prescient recognition of my future success. The narrative was being rewritten in real time to accommodate the uncomfortable reality that they had completely misjudged someone who had been sitting right next to them in algebra class. The transformation in how I was being portrayed was remarkable and somewhat disturbing. The same people who had dismissed me as forgettable were now claiming to have always seen potential greatness in me. Madison's social media accounts, which I was shown by concerned staff members monitoring online discussions about my relief operations, painted a picture of our high school relationship that bore no resemblance to reality.
Always knew Sophia was destined for amazing things, read one of her Facebook posts above a photo from our senior year showing me in the background of a group shot. So proud to have grown up with such an inspiring leader. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. The woman who had publicly mocked me 3 months earlier was now claiming to have been an early supporter and friend. It was a masterclass in social repositioning, the kind of shameless historical revision that Madison had probably perfected over decades of maintaining her social standing. But I had more important concerns than social media narratives. The relief operation was reaching a critical phase where we needed to transition from emergency response to long-term reconstruction support. This required different skills and different organizational approaches, as well as coordination with Philippine government agencies and international development organizations. Working with local officials, we developed a comprehensive reconstruction plan that would restore not just basic infrastructure, but improve disaster preparedness for future emergencies. Schools would be rebuilt with stronger earthquake resistance. Hospitals would have backup power systems and better emergency protocols. Water treatment facilities would have redundant systems to maintain service during disasters. It was during one of these planning sessions that I received another unexpected communication from my past. This time, it was Derek Voss, my former classmate who had shown genuine kindness at the reunion. Unlike Madison's calculated contact attempts, his message was simple and sincere. Sophia, been following your work in the Philippines. Incredible what you're accomplishing. Not surprised you're leading such important work. Always knew you had something special. Hope you're taking care of yourself in such difficult conditions. Derek. The contrast with Madison's approach was striking. Derek's message focused on the work itself and my well-being, not on how my prominence might benefit him or his social connections. It was the kind of authentic recognition that meant more than all the retroactive claims of friendship and support. As the relief operation entered its 4th week, we had established sustainable systems for ongoing humanitarian assistance and begun the complex process of transferring operational control to Philippine authorities and international development organizations. The emergency crisis had passed, and the focus was shifting from emergency response to long-term rebuilding. My role was evolving as well. The success of the Philippine operation had led to additional responsibilities in international humanitarian coordination.
The president had asked me to develop protocols for future disaster response operations, drawing on the lessons learned from this mission. It was challenging work that combined military logistics expertise with diplomatic sensitivity and humanitarian priorities. But it was also work that carried increasing public visibility. News coverage of the Philippine relief operation had been extensive, and my role in coordinating the international response had been prominently featured. This wasn't the kind of behind-the-scenes work that had characterized most of my military career. It was public service in the most literal sense, with global audiences watching and evaluating our effectiveness. The increased visibility came with unexpected consequences. Interview requests from major news organizations, speaking invitations from universities and policy institutes, even approaches from publishers interested in book deals about leadership and crisis management. My staff screened these requests carefully, accepting only those that served legitimate public information purposes or supported military recruitment and morale. But among the serious professional opportunities were an increasing number of requests that seemed motivated more by social climbing than genuine interest in humanitarian work or military service. Old acquaintances who had never shown interest in my career were suddenly eager to renew contact. Organizations that had never acknowledged my existence were offering awards and recognition. The pattern became even more pronounced when I returned to the United States 6 weeks after the earthquake. The Philippine government had officially thanked the American people for our assistance, and President Duterte had specifically mentioned my leadership in coordinating the international response. CNN ran a special report on America's Quiet Heroes, featuring my humanitarian work alongside profiles of other military leaders who had distinguished themselves in crisis situations. It was after this broadcast that the flood of contact attempts from my past reached almost overwhelming levels. My staff had to establish specific protocols for handling what we began calling social reconnaissance, attempts by people from my personal history to leverage newfound recognition of my professional success for their own purposes. Madison's efforts were particularly persistent and creative. After being diplomatically deflected in her attempts to secure me as a keynote speaker, she began approaching my staff with various proposals for collaboration between her charitable organizations and military humanitarian programs. Each pitch emphasized her long-standing friendship with me and her early recognition of my leadership potential. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez handled these approaches with military professionalism and barely concealed amusement. General, Mrs. Sterling called again about partnering with the Children's Foundation on what she's calling Generals and Galas, a series of charity events featuring military leaders. She mentioned several times that you two have been close friends since high school. I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. Madison was now attempting to monetize our high school connection, despite having spent decades dismissing my career and mocking my achievements. The entrepreneurial creativity was impressive, even if the ethical foundation was questionable. Standard response, Sarah, I instructed. All partnership requests should be directed through official channels and evaluated based on program merit, not personal connections. But Madison's persistence proved remarkable. When direct approaches failed, she began working through mutual connections. Derek Voss called to tell me that Madison had contacted him, asking him to serve as an intermediary for renewed communication with me. Other classmates reported similar approaches, with Madison presenting herself as my longtime friend who was simply trying to reconnect for purely personal reasons. The campaign reached its peak when Madison arranged for a local Florida newspaper to run a feature story about hometown heroes, prominently featuring my humanitarian work in the Philippines. The article included quotes from several classmates, including a lengthy statement from Madison about our supposed friendship and her pride in my achievements. Sophia and I have always been close, the article quoted her as saying. Even in high school, I could see that she was destined for great things. She had this quiet strength and intelligence that I always admired. I'm so proud to call her my friend and to see how she's used her talents to serve our country and help people around the world. When my staff showed me the article, I had to admit a grudging admiration for Madison's tactical sophistication. She had managed to create a public narrative of our friendship that would be difficult to contradict without appearing petty or ungracious. It was a masterful piece of social engineering that established her connection to my success while positioning herself as a supportive friend rather than an opportunistic social climber. The article also served another purpose. It pressured me to respond to her outreach attempts, since ignoring someone who had publicly praised my service and claimed longtime friendship would reflect poorly on my character and professionalism. I realized that Madison had created a situation where acknowledging her would validate her revisionist history of our relationship, while ignoring her would make me appear ungrateful and antisocial. It was a sophisticated social trap that demonstrated why she had been so successful in navigating elite social circles for decades. But I had learned something important from my years in military leadership. Sometimes the best response to sophisticated manipulation is simple, direct honesty. Rather than playing the social games Madison had mastered, I could respond with the straightforward professionalism that had served me well in much more complex and dangerous situations. I instructed my staff to draft a standard thank you letter acknowledging the newspaper article and expressing general appreciation for community support of military service members. The letter made no specific reference to Madison's claims about our friendship, but thanked all my former classmates and community members who had expressed support for our humanitarian work. It was a diplomatically neutral response that neither validated nor contradicted Madison's narrative, while focusing attention on the substantive work rather than personal relationships. More importantly, it allowed me to maintain my integrity without being drawn into social conflicts that had nothing to do with my actual responsibilities and commitments. The experience had taught me something valuable about the nature of success and recognition. Madison and others from my past were now eager to claim association with my achievements, but their interest was fundamentally self-serving. They weren't inspired by the humanitarian work or military service itself. They were attracted to the social capital that came with being connected to someone who had achieved public recognition. Real friendship and support, I had learned, was what Derek Voss had offered: acknowledgement of the work itself, concern for my well-being, and respect for my choices without any expectation of personal benefit.
It was what my military colleagues provided: professional respect based on competence and character, loyalty based on shared values and mutual trust, recognition based on actual contributions rather than social positioning. As I settled back into my regular duties at the Pentagon, I reflected on the strange journey from high school reunion to international crisis management to renewed contact with my past. The experiences had reinforced my understanding of what really mattered in life: meaningful work that contributes to something larger than myself, relationships built on genuine mutual respect and shared values, recognition based on actual achievements rather than social connections. Madison can would write our history all she wanted, could claim friendship and early recognition of my potential, could leverage my public prominence for her own social advancement. It didn't change the reality of what had actually happened between us, or the fundamental difference in our values and priorities. More importantly, it didn't diminish the satisfaction I found in my work or the relationships I had built with people who knew and respected me for who I actually was, rather than what I could do for their social standing. The reunion had been a strange detour into a world I had left behind long ago, but it had ultimately reinforced my appreciation for the world I had chosen to inhabit. 6 months after the Philippine earthquake, I was promoted to Deputy Secretary of Defense, making me one of the highest-ranking women in American military history. The promotion ceremony was attended by senior officials from across the government, military leaders from allied nations, and family members of military personnel I had served with throughout my career. I looked out at the audience of people who had supported my career and contributed to my success, and I realized that none of them had known me in high school. They knew me based on my professional achievements, my character under pressure, my ability to lead in difficult circumstances. Their respect was earned through decades of service, not claimed through historical revision or social networking. That evening, my phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from around the world: military colleagues, government officials, international partners, humanitarian workers I had served with in the Philippines, and, inevitably, a message from Madison Westbrook. "Sophia, saw the news about your promotion. So proud of my friend's incredible success. Hope we can connect soon to celebrate." I read the message and then deleted it without responding. Some chapters of life were worth revisiting for the lessons they taught. Others were simply worth leaving closed.